Yada 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 yada. Body yada 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 yada. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Hello. Let's talk about body horror. And I say that tentatively. Tentatively because I'm not really a fan of body horror. Body horror is one of those genres that I quite literally have to be in the mood for. And 9 times out of 10, it's mostly for nostalgia. Like Reanimator, for example, I think it might be the only body horror movie that I have seen enough times where I could quote it at will. Like literally just a week ago, I texted a friend of mine, "Who's going to believe a talking head get a job in a sideshow?" And no, they didn't get the reference, which is actually the real tragedy. But body horror movies, the reason why they're not really my favorites is because they're not really for the faint of heart. If you tend to like your horror romantic and gauzy and with Tangerine Dream playing in the background, body horror is probably not going to be your jam. I mean, it takes a special kind of person to be into this genre, and while I'm certainly not hating on anyone who loves their body horror, I honestly have to question your mental health a little bit if this is your favorite subgenre of horror. But I mean, only a little. I'd worry more if torture porn was your favorite, to be quite honest. So, as a rule, if you're going to watch body horror and you are at all squeamish, I would highly suggest you treat it like you're going to go swimming. Eat like an hour before you settle in. I mean, like most of it is pretty gross. Not all of it, though. It really depends on what tier we're talking about. For review, in terms of horror, I have a personal rating system. I believe I've talked about it either here or on TikTok. But my personal rating system is kind of like the iceberg listens that I rate how messed up a movie is. Now, me, I do it in tiers, four to be specific. Tier one typically involves movies that you could watch with your kids and grandma in the same room. So think Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, that sort of thing. Maybe even something from the Hammer Film Collection. Maybe a few of those movies, like something really, really light, tame, etc. Tier two, you're getting into your basic garden variety horror movies. So like 80s slasher flicks like Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, or 90s thrillers like Silence of the Lambs. I would put those in tier two. Now, tier three, we're getting into serious horror, like no training wheels. This is for your horror movie watchers. I'm talking Hellraiser series or Midsummer or Barbarian, that sort of thing. And tier four, of course, is the highest tier, and it is composed strictly of movies that universally can only be watched once. So, like a Serbian film, or the Evil Dead remake, or The Sadness, Martyrs, those kind of movies. Now, anything above a tier four is very most likely illegal and will probably get you put on a watch list if you even look it up. Now, if we're talking about body horror, typically most of those fall somewhere between three and four. But honestly, if we're going by the actual definition of what body horror is, you could probably find something decent across every single tier. But to truly understand what body horror entails, let's do a little history lesson. Okay, let's start with the basic definition of body horror. Google defines the genre as focusing on the unnatural or grotesque alteration, destruction, or transformation of the human body. The basic idea is largely to express issues that we mortals have over our own bodies and things like that. It covers things like the loss or gaining control over our own personal meat prisons and what that all means. And so, by that definition, the first body horror film is probably going to land right at the feet of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The original book was written in 1818, and the very first movie was in 1910. Okay, so as you probably already know, the story of the Frankenstein monster is about a scientist who is basically trying to create life, and he does so by digging up and sewing together the body parts of the deceased. then running an electric current through said body. It's a tale as old as time and has literally been repeated over and over and over again. I think they make a new Frankenstein like monster movie every 5 to 10 years. But the reason why we can call Frankenstein the body horror movie that jumped off the entire subgenre is because it deals with trying to have a measure of control over the one thing that all of our meat prisons have to face at one point in time or another, which by the dictionary definition of body horror puts you firmly in the transformation category. Frankenstein's influence within the subgenre of body horror is pretty significant. Like keep in mind that this is the very first time that audiences were kind of introduced to the whole idea of conquering that one thing that we all fear. And it's also the one thing that every single body is programmed to do, and that's to die. And that's huge. And from Frankenstein, we can draw a line to so many other body horror films leading all the way up to the present. Like, if not for Frankenstein, we don't get the next big horror film that's to come, which, interestingly enough, most film historians say comes about 40 or so years later in 1955's The Quartermass Experiment, which is something that I firmly disagree with because, I mean, The Invisible Man and Jekyll and Hyde are right there, and that was the 30s. But from those movies, by the 50s and 60s, you get Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Fly and The Tingler. And we're not even in the 70s yet. We're not even in Cronenberg territory yet. This is just in the early age of movies. But the thing that I always thought was really cool about body horror is that in terms of special effects, it is the one subgenre where the game is constantly being upped. Like, I'm willing to bet you that thanks to the steady stream of body horror films that have come out over the years, stock in latex and corn syrup has probably been on a steady incline. And not for nothing, even though I'm not a huge body horror fan, if you've watched any of my videos, somewhere in there, I'm probably going to mention a body horror film. Like my favorite of all time, The Thing, for example. Don't worry, I'm not going to go on yet another tangent about The Thing. We're going to talk about other body horror in this video. But taking it back, consider 1931's Jekyll and Hyde, which features an innovative technique for the transformation from Jekyll to Hyde using only color filters. The process was so cool and so seamless that variations of the technique have been used in movies all the way into the latter parts of the 20th century. Off the top of my head, they used it in Hausu, 1977's Japanese film Hausu. And like for the record, my all-time favorite use of this technique was probably 1937's Shh, the Octopus. I know. Don't laugh at the name. It's the actual name of the movie, but all that being said, that is probably the one thing I will always appreciate about body horror. Because of the nature of what it is, body horror is typically the bar when it comes to special effects in any movie. I think that if you are into practical effects in particular, this is where you'll find some of the best practical effects you've ever seen in your life in body horror films. And that's even up until today. And in my opinion, I think that that's because makers of really good body horror are more like the Michelangelos or the great sculptors and artists of the art world. Like there's a real art to these creatures that are being created in horror films and also in body horror films. It's like the art of changing the human body. It's really kind of cool when you think about it. So like the movies that I always talk about when we're talking about body horror are pretty much boiled down to The Thing, American Werewolf in London, Hellraiser, and Scanners, but mostly because of the head explodey scene. Which, if you've never seen Scanners and you don't know about the head explodey scene, you should probably definitely check that out because it's one of the coolest parts of the movie. For one thing, the process of creating it was a lot. more complicated than you might imagine. They literally had to construct a at the head with a plaster skull on the inside and then fill it with animal livers and leftover lunch meat and all sorts of gross stuff. But then they do that and then they set it up and they get behind it and blow it away with a shotgun. I'm not kidding. I wish I were kidding about that. I am not. They set it up in a chair, crouched behind it, aimed, and blew the fuck out of it using a shotgun. And mind you, that's what they settled on. The special effects department went through a whole lot of changes before they finally decided that that was the thing that was going to make the head exploding look real. I mean, they tried making a gelatin balloon head, but it looked too hokey when they inflated it. They tried to blow it up with pyrotechnics, but that was too much smoke. They tried a plaster head and then a wax one. Like, it was a whole thing. But the end result is pretty awesome when you see it on film. And mind you, what you see on film is the third try. And the funny thing is that it's the third try because the first one was way too good, and they really wanted to avoid an X rating, which is an NC-17 rating by today's standards. But yeah, the process of using practical effects in body horror is still something that's used today, quite a bit actually. To use the sculptor analogy, the beauty and the horror of the body is sometimes best expressed with what you can feel, the tangible, if you will. Now, that's not to say the CGI still isn't used. It is. But I would say that the best body horror exists through the use of latex and corn syrup. So, all that being said, allow me to list a few of my favorite body horror films. And these films that I recommend because of how the filmmakers decided to lean so hard into practical effects. At the top of my list currently is probably going to be last year's The Substance. Now, this movie was nominated for 5 Academy Awards and one for makeup and hair. Yeah. Which, by the way, there is no special effects category per se. There's a visual effects category, um, which is because of the whole CGI thing. So that's why Dune won as opposed to The Substance. Anyway, I've got a lot of opinions on that, but we're just going to move on. The writer and director of The Substance is Coralie Fargit, and I'm pretty sure I mispronounced that. Please forgive me. So she wanted to do this movie with as little CGI as possible. So she hired on special effects guru Pierre Olivier Persin. Now, if you don't know who he is, give him a look on IMDb. I think the most famous thing he's known for is his work on Game of Thrones, which, if you've seen Game of Thrones, yeah, so in The Substance, like I said before, there is very little CGI. Like almost everything from Margaret Qualley's boobs to the actual monster at the end of the movie was done using a variety of special effects. Like my favorite effect in this movie has to do with the monster's final scene where there's like tons of blood shooting out of it. That required 30,000 gallons of fake blood and a fire hose. I'm just saying it's a crime that it didn't get any awards. It's a straight up crime. To me, I feel like it's highway robbery. It was a crime. But whatever. Anyway, next on the list is going to be From Beyond. This one's a deep cut. It's part of the whole Lovecraftian movie block that Jeffrey Combs was in the 80s. That being said, please don't ask me what this movie is about. I please don't. And it's not that I couldn't explain it to you. I could. I could totally explain it to you. And I could do it in probably a really good scientific way, you know, discussing dimensional universes and portals and stuff like that. But if I went into that, I would also have to explain why this is happening in an old house that kind of looks like the murder house in American Horror Story. And also this scene, yeah. But this was one of those movies that was heavy on special effects. Like they had to use four separate special effects teams to make it all come together. And also, this was in the early days of using digital effects alongside the practical ones. But make no mistake, the majority of this movie is all practical, and they really stretched that budget to the wall. Also, this is my favorite scene, second only to this one.
It ain't no.
Okay, so lastly is probably going to be 1986's remake of The Fly. Now, I have to put this on the list because we cannot talk about body horror without including at least one of David Cronenberg's movies. I feel like if I don't bring him up in this video, I'll rightfully lose all credibility within the horror community. I mean, you got to give it up for a movie that turns you on with peak Jeff Goldblum and then rips it all away systematically by packing him in about 5 pounds of prosthetics to turn him into Brundlefly. And in this one, there are just too many scenes to choose from. If I were to pick a favorite body horror effect, like there's from the melting hands with acid vomit, and then the broken arm, wrestling bones, and the ears falling off, and the teeth falling out. I'm just saying that there had to be more gelatin and latex in use on this set than there was at a Diddy party. Also, fun fact, the substance borrowed a lot of the effects from this version of The Fly into that movie, as well as should. Like Cronenberg movies are like the blueprints of practical effects. And I honestly, I could go on with other ones. In fact, I think I might make a list of this in my Bendables. So if you're following me on Bendable, look out for a list for body horror. If not, you should probably follow me on it anyway. The link is in my description. But yeah, whether you're looking to be grossed out or you're doing a project on your next science thing, maybe, body horror is the light and it is the way for some of us. For me, not all the time. For me, it's like the occasional chocolate dessert. It's good in small doses. Okay, so that's this week's video essay. Thank you so much for listening to me rant yet again. I post every 2 weeks, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you will not miss the next post. That being said, see you next time. Bye.